Hello, everyone. I'm Brent Steele, professor and Wormuth Presidential Chair in Political Science at the University of Utah, and I want to welcome everyone joining today's event hosted by Ethics and International Affairs, the Journal of the Carnegie Council. This panel is part of a special content series in the run-up to Global Ethics Day 2022, which will take place on October 19th this year. Each year on Global Ethics Day, Carnegie Council calls upon schools, organizations, and individuals from around the world to take action to empower ethics. And it is within that framework that we have organized today's discussion, specifically focused on ethics in the classroom and empowering the next generation of students and thinkers. I'm honored to be joined today by Professor Michael Blake, Professor of Philosophy, Public Policy, and Governance at the University of Washington, Dr. Yuna Han, Departmental Lecturer in International Relations at the University of Oxford, and Dr. İlgü Özler, Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the State University New York, New Paltz, and also Director of the SUNY Global Engagement Program. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone in the audience to please use the chat feature to submit questions for our panelists, which we will address towards the end of the discussion. So today we have two sets of questions to start and shape our discussion. The first asks each panelist to identify which issues you focus on in your approaches to ethics in the classroom and what you find are the biggest challenges for this considering, well, everything that's been going on around us. But are there also opportunities as well? So each panelist can take 5 minutes apiece for this set of questions, and we'll start with Dr. Blake, move to Dr. Han, and finish with Dr. Özler. So Dr. Blake, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me at this event. I was very glad to get this question because it gave me a chance to crystallize some of the things that I've been worried about over the past couple of years as the world seems to have gotten much more interesting in all the wrong ways. And I've occasionally wondered what the point is of thinking or teaching about ethics seriously when the world seems to be so full of just bad things that are recurrent and difficult to dispel. And when you asked in your question, sort of what is the major difficulty that we're facing, I realized something about my classes, which is that I used to have to argue very strongly for the first couple of weeks against ethical relativism and the thought that there was something going on beyond just pounding the table and asserting your own privilege whenever you made an ethical point. And increasingly, that's not the worry. I think my students have moved from ethical relativism to despair. And now the challenge isn't getting students to think that the world might have ethics as a part of it, to getting them to think that ethics could be a guide to action or attainable or anything other than just a benchmark of how far we are falling. So I think the challenge is now trying to get students, when they look at the international realm, to think that there is any hope. And the part that ethics plays in this, of course, is going to be very controversial, but I've made some moves in my teaching that I think have helped me potentially. At the very least, it's how I've tried to respond. One of them is by focusing less on how philosophy in particular has traditionally understood itself, which is with ethical evaluation and overall judgment and the thrill of condemning others, towards ethics as a part of practical guidance, of figuring out where we need to go and why, and how to understand that. And I've often tried to begin with much more practical forms of engagement. How can people do right in their careers? How can people become good at the task of being a citizen? And to understand that requires practical skill, of course, but it also requires some knowledge of final purposes and what it is that we want to do or avoid doing. And so trying to move towards a more role-based and positional account of what the point is of doing ethics can help students, especially policy students who are often intending to work in international development or international politics, with some toolkit and a vocabulary with which to articulate what it is that's the point of their jobs. I've also tried to move, I think, away from grand theory. I mean, Kant and utilitarianism and all of these lovely theories, that's what I was raised with, philosophically speaking, and I love them. But there is a sense in which when things are on fire, they are luxuries until demonstrated to become relevant. And so I've often started to look more at particular low to the ground issues and dilemmas, especially in the first person, when people face particular worries about disparate goods that they might pursue. What tools can we provide them? And that is, at the very least, it holds out the possibility of there being some practical guidance to people who are about to go out into a very different world than the one that I inhabited when I was young, several million years ago. But I've also, I think, at a more philosophical vein, tried to understand philosophy in particular as offering the possibility of correct rage. I hear from my students, and in myself for that matter, a lot of inchoate rage at the various things, including the destruction of our physical climate, the abandonment of longstanding international norms in the past couple of months with the Russian adventure in the Ukraine, towards just a sense that everything is awful and nothing is good. And one of the tasks of ethics that I don't think we talk enough about is the possibility of clear-headed rage, that to rage correctly is the first step towards practical guidance. And I often tell my students now that they come in full of rage, and although I'm not a therapist and I think philosophy is poorly suited for therapy, it does at least offer the possibility of the technical vocabulary with which rage can be understood, explained, and guided towards practical alteration of the terrible world that people of my age are leaving to the young. So all of that is very much a philosopher's answer, because I haven't talked about specific issues or specific things. Instead, I've talked about how I talk. But I think at this point, I'm going to leave that and listen to what other people have said about this question.
Thanks so much, Michael. That's fantastic. Next up, we have Dr. Hahn. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm also very kind of pleased to get an invitation for this event, because it's something that's quite interesting to think about and really gives me a chance also to reflect on what's happening in my classrooms. I think just to kind of echo a lot of things that Michael had been saying, I think one of the challenges that I see in our classroom, and I'm coming from the perspective of teaching international relations as an empirical political science, not necessarily as a philosophy, right? So we're, and the way we have taught international relations, I think in a lot of universities, as an empirical political science, is to have this sharp distinction between the normative and ethical realm versus the more empirical causal sort of descriptions of how things are and why things come to be in that kind of way. And I think students increasingly come in dissatisfied with this stark distinction between the discussion of ethics and normative issues and the discussion of describing the world as is, and the more realistic picture of how international politics looks like. But despite the fact that they're quite dissatisfied with this dichotomy, I think one of the challenges is that they don't really know where to go from there, if that makes sense. So a lot of the kind of grand theorizing we have done in international relations, as well as a lot of the more empirically oriented theories of causal explanations of why things happen in international politics, we now have a lot of critical scholarship that look at both the normative dimensions of these causal explanations and its deficiencies. A lot of students kind of come in buying into this, very excited about this, but then, as I like to say with my colleagues, they don't know what to do with bad knowledge. We've kind of decided that some of these things are quote unquote bad knowledge, but the challenge is to then to decide what do we do from there. So I do think that there is a sense of despair, or kind of feeling like you're on a cliff's edge, and a lot of things are in flux, but too many things are in flux, so you don't actually know how to chart your course forward as a student in the classroom, but also going into the world. So I think that's kind of one of the major kind of bigger conceptual challenge that I see. And in that, I think one of the more disheartening things that I see sometimes is that I see then students, after sort of struggling through that kind of issue of what do I do with bad knowledge, is to kind of go back to their known priors, right? A lot of the discussions become incredibly based on sovereigntist or nation state based kind of understandings of international politics, which is not very suitable for the big challenges that they're interested in the first place, that gets them kind of riled up in the first place, like climate change, as well as the global pandemic that we've been living through. So in that sense, kind of this despair sometimes, I think, pushes students to go back to things that they've known before, or they kind of see as tools that they find either safe or knowable, rather than kind of really pushing themselves to think out beyond those tools and conceptual vocabulary that we've been providing them with over many years. So I think one of the things that I've been trying to do with mixed degree of success is to really push for them to think creatively about politics not as is, but politics that could be. And sometimes students say, you know, it feels like we're always talking about a potential transformation that will never come. But that's kind of the point of it, right? So I remember thinking about, remember kind of discussing in the class of the degrowth movement, as well as kind of thinking about the ethical unit of politics and rights as the planet, as opposed to sort of the individual within a capitalist society. A lot of students kind of take from that and step back and say, this is never going to happen in my lifetime. This is incredibly unrealistic. But the point of those kind of exercises is to not necessarily think about how do we implement this tomorrow, but kind of stretch our kind of conceptual boundaries and kind of our theoretical thinking, so that hopefully when students are about to make kind of personal political choices, that they have a slightly more kind of creative range of things to draw upon, as opposed to simply going back to the known kind of prior that they came into the classroom with. So I think that's kind of one way I've been dealing with that. I'll leave it at that here, and hopefully we can kind of pick this up later.
Thanks so much, Yuna. That's absolutely brilliant. Next up, Dr. Özler.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. And I think mine piggybacks into the philosophy and political science, and now we're taking it into practice. You know, translating ethics in the classroom is a complex matter, and for the sake of time, I'll try to make 3 points that I try to integrate into my classes. One is glass is half full. Number 2 is we all have impact, but we need to understand our impact in the larger global context. And the third point is that what we consider to be ethical may not be what is necessarily just, and we need to always try to foster ethics towards justice. And I run 2 programs, the UN semester and the SUNY Global Engagement program in New York City, with strong components tying theory to practice, where students engage directly with hearing from practitioners at the United Nations about multilateralism, or they become practitioners through their internships and we do seminars and colloquium with them throughout this process. In both cases, in class setting, we tackle big issues of the day, covering multilateralism, role of global civil society, sustainable development, global climate crisis, human rights, women's rights, big questions, right? The first goal is to understand the problem and the potential solutions. I'm a social scientist, so we connect theory and policy. Before we can start to translate global ethics into practice, we first need to have practical knowledge of what is deemed ethically possible or responsible. For this, we start out with the multilateral frameworks created in the international community that makes our idealistic base from which to start our work. And, you know, human rights, humanitarian law, sustainability frameworks. We study, you know, UDHR, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, the basics. We try to understand global problems using a social scientific lens, acknowledging that social scientific measures have their biases as well. One example that I use in class, for example, is the UN Sustainable Development Goals 1, combating poverty, and Goal 10, combating inequalities, how we define poverty and inequality have implications of how we measure and combat those issues. So while the international community made great progress in the development of these ethical standards for us, right, in areas that we study, these are not perfect, and it's important to understand where and why we study where and why great progress has been made and what works. So that's the glass half full. The second point is that we have great impact, however small it might be, yet the individual change is never sufficient. So thus we need to keep the bigger picture in mind, and understanding our place understanding our place in the larger picture is important. Here in class, we discuss about the difference between advocacy and humanitarian work, right? Humanitarians see their impact immediately. You can help a refugee family when they're helping them to settle. You can bring a bathroom to a rural school to help the girl child to go to school. You can help bring tents to a displaced family. These are immediate results, yet these are not finite solutions. They are temporary, stopgap, limited measures to help those who suffer from structural shortcomings and failures. On the other hand, policy advocates rarely see the results of their work, right? You might get a sentence in or a word into a policy that might make change, but this is rare. You rarely see the results of your work, and it's frustrating and it's slow. So there are no immediate visible change for those policy advocates, and never enough resources for those who are humanitarians. Thus, connecting our micro impact day to day to the larger frameworks becomes a key to keeping the advocates and the humanitarians going. And this is something that we address in the class setting. This brings me to my third and final point. So, what is positive change? Ethics is about what is right and what is wrong, morally good or bad, how we should live our lives to fulfill our moral values. And in this context, it is important that we examine what is acceptable and deemed ethical in relation to justice. We use the classroom as a democratic space to understand our global universal values from multiple perspectives. The ethical practices considered good for one group of people may come at the cost of another. And I can elaborate a little more when we are discussing the challenges question, that the global ethical practices include an understanding of our global current values and their impact, but most importantly, strong reflection on how ethics intersects with justice is something that we should consider. And I don't know if I have any time left, but
you got about 30 seconds or so. Yeah,
okay,
that's great.
so,
Go ahead. Yeah.
So I, among other practitioners, right, we think about global citizenship to be a good thing, right? So, but construction of global citizenship is seen as an affront to many local traditions. So we struggle with the fact that how do you reconcile the local and the global in the context of class? Despite being associated with, for example, social democratic values, cosmopolitan global citizenship still lives in the context of the sovereign state, thus associated global social democracy limited to maybe those privileged in the Western global north or Western countries, leaving many behind. So how do we actually negotiate this notion of global citizenship that exists within the context of an understanding of sovereign state And also that has been developed associated with colonial and neo-colonial legacies. How do we kind of reconcile those issues? And also in the context of the neoliberal economic principles that leaves many behind, right? So those are some of the issues that we struggle with in our class. And then as students change theory into practice, we discuss about what they're experiencing on the ground, and then use those examples in the classroom setting. I can articulate more if there are any questions about it.
Thanks so much, Ilgü. Thank you. We're going to move on to a second question, but in the meantime, I just want to remind the audience to please use the chat feature to submit your questions for our panelists. We'll get to those after this next set of questions and some responses. So second question asks each of the panelists, what kinds of materials you utilize in your classroom, including strategies and tactics for technological engagement with students? How has this changed over the years, especially in light of the pandemic, if at all for you? Do you still primarily use readings, articles, texts, or do you include podcasts, videos, music, something else? We'll just go in the same order again. No reason to switch up the batting lineup. And we'll begin with Dr. Blake, move to Dr. Hahn, and then finish with Dr. Özler. And we can take a little bit less time here, just a couple, 2-3 minutes. So Michael?
Yeah, thanks. This was also a great question, especially after a couple of years of quietly or loudly screaming about Zoom and its effect upon pedagogy. So I actually want to start with a very old thought, which is that the core of ethics is conversation, and that ethics, to understand your own beliefs, the beliefs of others, it requires first the site within which you can articulate what you think ethics demands of you. And then you listen to what others say about it. It has to be a very particular kind of listening that involves treating other people not as presumptive enemies in face of disagreement, but as people who are trying to make this same sense you are of a very confusing moral universe. In most of my classes, I end up talking about this wonderful Dickens phrase, fellow passengers to the grave, that we're sharing a very limited life and the universe is morally confusing. Instead of immediately attacking, why don't we listen? And technologically speaking, anything that enables a better conversation is a good thing. And there are some ways in which the past couple of years have shown us both the power and the problems associated with technologically mediated forms of conversation. What's good about it is it enables conversations that otherwise would be difficult or impossible. If you look at the four faces I'm looking at right now, I think we're all in different time zones. I believe, well, at least 3 time zones, I know that. And it enables access to these conversations. It enables the ability to reach more people. But on the other hand, it isn't as effective at producing actual conversation that is deep and immediate and respectful as seeing faces directly unmediated. So in one sense, I think we've grown more used to this sort of technological mediation. And in another sense, I still resisted in favor of some fairly old-fashioned methods. I still like texts because they actually offer the opportunity of slowing down and listening very carefully to what other people have thought about the world. But I do think that over the past couple of years, the nature of the text in question has become less restrictive. I think a lot of disciplines, especially philosophy, very jealously guard their borders against that which is not us. And this sort of territorial disciplinary boundary drawing, I think, is potentially crumbling to a bit. So in recent classes, I've actually tended to include a great many materials that are not philosophical texts. I have, in a recent class on the nature of political and moral wrongdoing, a taxonomy of ways of being awful. We've actually read poetry. We've seen movies, including Ikiru and Afterlife, on the wrongness of imposing death. We've read a lot of biographies of people who've had to experience horrible things to understand the phenomenology of what it's like to experience forms of evil. And in general, I think we're increasingly willing to listen to conversations that don't begin with the disciplinary training that many of us were taught to prize as the only true form of engagement with the world. I think we're increasingly willing to listen, and we increasingly have technological modes by which to listen to others. But I do sometimes worry that we, or at least university administrators, sometimes fall in love with their tools and they prize novelty because it's novel. That's my grumpy old philosopher moment. So I'll end on that.
Thanks so much, Michael. Yuna, please.
Yeah, I'm also a slightly more old-fashioned ilk when it comes to the kind of material that I like to use, but perhaps it's because I'm at an institution that is quite a few hundred years old, and it's to try and change this place is a very difficult thing. But I do think that when the pandemic hit, I think there was a lot of excitement to using things like podcasts and videos in particular to get students engaged. And one of my takeaways from that period of lockdown, and in the UK, our lockdown period was fairly long, is that a lot of these kind of multimedia resources only really facilitate kind of passive consumption of knowledge and debates, as opposed to really forcing students to actively participate in that. So it was not really a good supplement or a really good substitute at all to the seminar discussions that are very prized at Oxford and other places as well, that really kind of bring that active kind of mode of not just conversing with other students and kind of getting that friction there, but really kind of processing what you've learned by talking about it live with your peers and your instructor as well. So I've been kind of thinking about ways to kind of increase that kind of active participation, even if it is in this kind of large scale Zoom environment where you are sort of participating, but there is significantly less sort of there's less of that spark that happens that when you're in the same room at the same time. And one thing I tried is to have anonymous surveys or anonymous kind of write-ins during the class itself, and have these like pop surveys. And what that served was, I've noticed when the class was online, discussion was online, students became much more reserved and timid about sharing their real views because they don't actually know their peers as well as they used to if they were in the same room. And so I would never kind of release it kind of raw, because we all know how these anonymized write-ins can look like when it isn't filtered. But I would use it as a way to sort of highlight to the class the diversity of views and diversity of reactions that can happen to one text, to one topic, etc. at any given moment. And sometimes I would do that live, so I would see all the results, but not necessarily the students, and I would try to kind of feed it back to them and say, like, look, we had very different reactions, so let's talk about it for a moment. I don't think, again, this is a very good substitute to sort of more traditional means of seminar discussion and teaching, but it is, I think, a different way of using the technology that is not simply about we create a sort of, fancy looking multimedia product that students have to consume, because a lot of their, I think, and a lot of mine also, like life during the lockdown in particular, was dominated by consuming passively these kinds of material. So I don't think we need to I didn't really feel the need to add more onto their list, if that makes any sense. When it comes to the use of text, again, it's partially me, partially the institution that I'm at. We're very text-based, but I think one thing, and sort of echoing what Michael is saying, that I'm trying to do is to get students to understand that there are insights and kind of things to learn from in text that are not necessarily quote unquote traditional academic articles or books. And this goes to newspaper articles and memoirs by feminist activists, etc. And increasingly, I'm finding students respond well to it, but also there's a lot of resistance towards kind of accepting that as the same level of importance as my kind of hard, serious academic text. So if I give 5 or 6 readings, which you often do at Oxford, for 1 week, clearly the one that students go to last is always the non-traditional text that I'm sort of inserted there. So that's sort of the challenge that I have in using this traditional mechanism of reading and discussing, but getting them to kind of read more broadly than what looks like academic, what they consider to be kind of hard academic texts.
Thanks so much, Yuna. That's absolutely brilliant. İlgü.
Thank you so much. So I'll talk more about my SUNY Global Engagement Program in New York City, where I have the privilege of having the same set of students for 3 separate classes, right? So this is the beauty of it. So they are doing their internship and experiencing their internship on the ground. And then we have a research colloquium where they develop a research paper on a subject that's relevant to their internship. And this is where it becomes, I have to be flexible because I have to become an expert on all things global. And then they do their papers. And if I try to encourage them to speak to their supervisors to develop topics that are relevant to the organization, right? So this way, the students can develop something that is applied, that can be used by the organization, and then also be a white paper or something that the organization is going to benefit from. So that kind of creates agency for the student, and that is a non-traditional way of looking at it. It would be much easier for me to kind of have them develop a topic that I'm familiar with and then have them write on that, but then it wouldn't give the student the ability to see impact, the change that they can bring. The second thing that we do is our global engagement seminar, where it's a traditional class where they do 3 readings every week on an issue that we are focusing on. Usually they are social scientific, quantitative. I'm a quantoid, so I like quantitative stuff. So, but I tell students there are findings in this, think about it. And also students are the ones that lead the discussion. So I run it like a seminar where the students are in charge. And then I tell them to bring examples from their organizations as they observe the organization as to whether there are consistencies or inconsistencies that they're observing on the ground based on the readings, right? So the reading finds X, and then you're observing that X in a board meeting in your organization at the IRC, for example. In this process, I mean, there's rarely things that I do in class where I use media or things like that. But one thing that I use, I think that it works, is we look at the evolution of humanitarian aid and how humanitarian issues are depicted by the media. And we use at that, we look at the 1984 Ethiopian famine reporting, the famous one, right? I have them watch that, and then I have them watch other coverage of the situation in Yemen or Ethiopia right now, and based on their readings, whether there has been a shift in media in depicting, who the culprits are, the political problems, right? So all those things, so I have them do some kind of observation through use of media, with little things like that. But I don't think I've changed the way I teach at all in the context of COVID, because I didn't have to do that much online teaching, to be honest. We did a lot of our work in person still. I don't know how I pulled it off, but we did. I was able to travel to New York City during the height of COVID. I don't know how it happened, but it happened.
Thanks so much. That's wonderful. Once again, I just wanted to remind audience members, and we already have some questions populated in the chat, but please put your questions into the chat for our panelists so that they can respond. We're going to flag, we have a couple that we already have been submitted that I'll flag, but if I could just kind of abuse my privilege here as chair to just kind of react to what's been mentioned already and to reflect a little bit upon my own experiences teaching international ethics this spring of 2022. I taught it here at the University of Utah. It's an upper level class where I use a lot of materials that would be familiar, I think, to all 4 of us and many members of the audience, but then updating it, especially in light of all of the things that are going on and have been going on and then happened during the spring as well. And I wanted to especially plug an article that Dr. Hahn did in co-authoring with a co-authored article in Ethics and International Affairs on COVID as a mass death event. It was published in 2021, but I assigned it to my students this spring. And thinking about some of the affective and emotional aspects of the classroom, but especially in today's day and age that both Michael and Yuna were speaking to, and how important it is, not just for thinking about a vernacular or a technical language, I think is what Michael called it, for rage, but a space for some of that rage, but then also grief. And some trauma as well. And so there is a challenge and a risk to that. And I think that's where, you know, I shouldn't call this a classical text that you three wrote and published, but it is a text in the sense of being an assigned article that can be very, very useful. It can give us a little bit of a space for especially things that our students are living through in the present, not just in the past. Several of them have had experiences with that as a mass death event that's impacted their families. And so that was just a fantastic article. It's in Ethics and International Affairs. I would highly suggest it as a way to shape a discussion on an event that a lot of students and citizens, for that matter, all throughout the world, and including here in the United States, have lived through. And it just provided such a really helpful discussion. Now, it had consequences as well. I had students that came up to me afterwards and said, that was a lot. It kind of brought back some things I haven't really thought about in a few years, or a few months or so, but I'm really glad that we had that discussion. And then I also wanted to mention that Carnegie Council has we're talking about the multimedia opportunities that they have. I assigned 2 panel discussions, much like this one, to my students, recognizing that there's different ways in which they consume this information and these arguments and these materials, as Yuna speaks to. It's not always great to encourage that passive consumption, but giving them options to be able to do so is great. And so one of the panels that was in October of 2020 that Carnegie hosted, much like this one, it was transferred in terms of being both transcribed and then also as audio and visual that students could just listen to on the train on the way in to class. It was on protest in perspective, relating to the transnational Black Lives Matter protest from the summer of 2020. That provided a really good set of issues for us to debate and discuss in class. And then there was another one on vaccine equity and ethics that was conducted in December of 2020. And so I just wanted to plug both the work of a panelist here and then also the work of the Carnegie Council. So with that, we do have some questions that have been put in the chat, and please, those of you that are in the audience, continue to put those in there for us. I'll throw out this one, and it's by Samuel Bradshaw, asking, are there any ethical frameworks from contemporary research that are particularly important to include in ethics curriculum today? So are there particular frameworks that, in addition to all the issues that we get to, all the topical issues and or all of the sort of purposes that you want to have in your classroom and in your class covered, are there any particular ethical frameworks that you would say are the most important ones to cover? And or let me just add on a little bit there. Are there some additional ones that maybe are a little bit newer or more recent developments that we need to include? So I don't really have a preference on who takes that. Whoever is ready to go, please go right ahead. Michael, please. Yes, thank you.
So I read this a couple of moments ago and immediately had a panic attack about remembering what the most important frameworks are, either current or otherwise. But then I think there's a response to this that might subtly change the question, which is how do you figure out what perspectives are needed, what frameworks are needed? And one thing that I've been trying to do more self-consciously has been to increase the number of first personal perspectives of how it is that we understand the intuitive sense of wrongness that many of us have when we examine certain things going on in the world. And then you figure out how those perspectives can lead to a change in what sorts of theoretical writings that we need to include. So here are 2 examples from some of the teaching I've done recently. One of them is about the nature of refugees. We often speak about refugees as a sort of problem, quote, for us in terms of how do we deal with this cost. And in fact, the experience of being encamped is itself a sort of deeply morally fraught circumstance. And some recent work by Serena Perec has tried to use theorists like Giorgio Agamben and the reduction to mere biology towards a mere species being. That's a theoretical perspective that helps us get some purchase on what's wrong with the ways that refugees experience life in these circumstances that the average stay in a camp, I think, is more than a decade. Another example from a former student of mine is the experience of women crossing borders in a time of increasing policing of the bodies of people who present as women, especially under circumstances of pregnancy, and the ways in which the woman's body is deemed transparent at the borders. Now, the first personal narratives of women writing about this, they lead naturally to a discussion of things in philosophy like epistemic injustice, Miranda Fricker's work on how the ascription of knowledge and expertise and authority over one's own self requires a certain language that can be taken seriously or not by others. This is a very long-winded way of saying that I think increasingly we have to let the issues dictate the theory as to which sorts of theories are going to take precedence in our teaching. And I say this as someone who is making almost a confession against interest, because at heart I'm a theorist. But as far as teaching and as far as learning goes, even about the world, listening to the people who are experiencing the most profound forms of dislocation can, I think, make a difference in what sorts of theories will make it into our teaching and into our writing.
Fantastic. Yuna or Ilgü?
Sure. I mean, just briefly, I think, I haven't necessarily integrated this very systematically, but I think one thing that I find kind of interesting to play around with is to kind of revisit the liberal ethics as a kind of starting point, not necessarily because I think that's the most important thing to understand, but because students come in with such an inbuilt set of assumptions that are built around particular understandings of liberalism. So I think it's kind of important for a curriculum to have a moment to kind of unpack that and kind of think about both its deficiencies and internal diversities and kind of how we can use that to kind of move forward or find different ways of thinking about politics. So that would be my 2 cents there.
Fantastic. Ilgü, what advice do you have for ethical frameworks?
I was having a pretty standard political science framework in my teachings, and as a department last year, we did a reflection on our curriculum and how we approach race, issues of race, and I've noticed that my work did not, because traditional international relations really does not have that much race as a variable integrated, and then it led me to incorporate some of the works of, for example, Errol Henderson's work on hidden in plain sight racism in international relations theory into my class, and students react very strongly to this work, really opening eyes as to how race as a variable works in international relations, right? So that's something that I have done last year, which I think really changed the discussion throughout the semester, right? Because people always reverted back to, we never used race as a variable, right? We have discussions about global South and global North, and those kinds of questions, never integrated this discussion from a race perspective, and it's been very interesting, actually. So that's something that that's recent for me.
Ilgü, can I ask just one question before we move on to another's regarding that? Was that something that you consciously sort of did kind of deductively on your own, for lack of a better term, or was that something that was facilitated by the discussions that you had with students and or the world around? I mean, in which direction, induction or deduction, so to speak?
It's in our department, we had a like, we went through our syllabus and we thought about, like, how many of our readings are by women? How many of our readings have been written by, how many of these are from different perspectives, right? So we kind of did like a collective soul searching as a department. And that was based on a lot of the discussion that was going on and our students on campus kind of having these discussions. And we wanted to have, for our assessment purposes, right, our self-assessment purposes, as a department, we did that. And when I noticed that this was actually a missing element in my class, I went and searched and included that in the class discussion. And I think that I thank the students on our campus, right? Because they're the ones that kind of were calling for our curriculum to be more responsive to diverse points of views, and that they're not inclusive of BIPOC communities. And so this was very much a reaction to also student demands as well. So definitely, I highly recommend doing that kind of self evaluation for any department, for any professor. And it was a great discussion in our department too, like how do we approach these issues.
Thanks so much. That's wonderful. So we have another question in our chat. And again, thank you all in the audience that are providing us questions in the chat. Continue to put those in there, and I'll flag them as they come in for our panelists. There's a question from Adam Reed Brown asking that he mentions, I know this has been touched upon a little, but he's curious whether we are all finding a higher degree of ethical despair, which was a phrase that Professor Blake mentioned in his opening remarks, among students in recent years with all the crises that bombard us every day. And if so, how you approach that mindset. So I think Yuna also talked about this as well, and it's definitely coming up in Olga's comments. So how do you all, I guess, handle that and mobilize it to some degree and maybe turn it around a little bit? So whoever would like to start with a response to that question, because it's one that I think we all struggle with, not only our students, but also those of us that are global citizens or citizens of our local and global communities.
I can start if you want.
Yeah,
right?
Ilga, yeah, please.
I mean, I'm also I'm on sabbatical right now from everything, but in my personal life, I've also been an activist. So I've been active with Amnesty International, right? And I try to kind of model to students that the struggle over meanings and activism over human rights is something that I struggle with all the time, right? So I struggle still at this stage of my life. Is it good to not have a position on war, for example, right? So is it good to, right? So those big questions that we are struggling with, and they have real finite implications about the kind of activism that you do and how you translate that on the ground. So I tell them that it's okay to struggle. It's okay to struggle with these questions, and then it never gets easy. But that means that in addition, what we need to do is that question of micro impact in the larger sense is always important, right? Do what you can. You cannot put the entire world's problems on your shoulders. As a human being, your impact is going to be finite, small, but you can always understand your place in the larger framework, right? In addition, I try to encourage my students to go into public service, but I also tell them that a lot of my students come from families that are not affluent. They're immigrant students. They're students who are from rural poverty. I tell them, like, you might end up having to go into private sector, and that's okay. But what you learn here is going to have relevance in how you translate and how you behave in that sector, right? So I had students, for example, who went into consulting. Like I had this one student who went into a consulting firm. She was Japanese, and she calls me and says, I have taught them about sustainable development goals, and they were all going to invest in Africa, right? So they're consulting with Japanese firms, and they're going to invest in Africa. And I convinced my boss that we should take Sustainable Development Goals of the UN as a framework in understanding where we should be investing, right? So that is like a tangible change that even if and she understands that Sustainable Development Goals are not perfect. She understands that they're not the answer to all, right? They're an imperfect solution to things. But she understands also that her impact is better than the alternative where they're going to go and impact for profit only, right? So it's kind of like, I want them to understand that their impact is never going to create the ultimate solution to all of our problems. But if they can make it better, then that's a good solution. And that's all they can expect of themselves.
Fantastic. Yuna.
Sure. I think what I try to emphasize in this moments of ethical despair, which I do think has increased a lot, particularly experiencing the past couple of years, is the idea of radical empathy and also like radical imagination. So political imagination. So and I say radical in the sense that like I'm trying to emphasize to them that feeling empathetic or kind of being able to understand how things are like for other people, so people in radically different situations across the globe, that in itself can be a politically radical thing, right? And it doesn't necessarily lead towards an immediate, tangible impact, but just kind of being cognizant of that and using that as your own kind of standard of engaging with the world in and of itself can be a move towards sort of thinking about the world in a very different way from the way that you have been taught or kind of we have found it in. So that's sort of one thing. And then the other thing, as I sort of mentioned in my opening comment, is trying to get them to think about kind of use their imagination in radical ways to think about political futures. And knowing that these are not going to be realistic in kind of an immediate sense, and that's not the point of it, but simply to be able to stretch their imagination in a way that they don't accept the priors as kind of a given kind of standard or framework to work with. So those are the kind of two things that I try to bring in, you know, when I'm faced with this wall of despair that you often see in students these days.
Michael?
I think I might be more of a fan of despair than the other two people who've spoken, because one of the places that I often begin with my students is an acknowledgement of loss and the fact that no matter how good our investment practices become, we're facing a world that will not be sustained in the trajectories of growth that we've had, in which the politics are going to be most likely considerably less empathetic in the near future, in which, you know, the ability to communicate across borders has led not just to positive conversations, but to contempt and hatred and a resurgence of certain varieties of fascism, and in which the students I teach are going to have lower standards of living than their parents, most likely, and that trend may continue. I think for me, one of the things to do is to not hide these losses and to make sure that it doesn't lead to retrenchment, selfishness, and an insistence on the preservation of what forms of domination these students can find over the other. So to begin with the recognition that in fact there is reason to be afraid, there is reason for pessimism, and then to return to this notion of doing what one can, where one can, along with something that philosophers are absolutely terrible at, which is reminding us of the obvious. I think philosophers, like most academics, they like it when there's novelty. Like I've always said to my students, like an argument that kicking puppies is a bad thing won't get you a top 5 journal publication. An argument that kicking puppies is great might. So we like controversy, we like novelty and so forth, but there's a task for keeping alive the moral truths that we tried to fight for over the past 150 years and imperfectly lived up to. There's a place for the preservation of that in favor of a thoroughgoing despair and a willingness to abandon even the attempt to show empathy. And this is where I really like the term that Professor Hahn used of radical empathy. The flame of empathy is a very fragile one, and acknowledging loss and despair might go some way towards giving people reason to try to keep it alive.
It's fantastic. So we have another question that I'm going to kind of shorten just a little bit because we have about 6 minutes left in our panel discussion. It's from Dr. Melinda Kita from the University of Tirana. And she mentions that she's done some work on ethics and the knowledge gained from pre-university level of education. And so I'm going to modify it a little bit for our panelists to respond to if they wish. She notices in her work that there's major weaknesses that are observed in the curriculum of pre-university. And so are there examples from our educational systems of how ethics is conceived and how it's incorporated? And so if I could just put maybe an additional coda to that to our panelists is how do we handle how ethics is treated before our students get to our universities and institutions. And so, and that's something that obviously goes beyond ethics. It goes into how political science or international relations or history or whatever our disciplinary background might be, international studies is treated before they get to our universities. But I'm just curious as to how we handle that and how we think about either successful curriculum and or the challenges that that may be entailed by the lack of ethics that could be treated before they get to the university. Michael, please.
I could just leap in on this because I find that a lot of what I have to do in my first level class is encourage some unlearning about what ethics is. And I often say that philosophy is one of those things that if you go to a Barnes and Noble and look at the philosophy section, you'll see some god-awful stuff ranging from astrology to Khalil Gibran to occasionally Garfield, right? And particularly with ethics, what I try to say to them is that we have sort of two images before college of what ethics is. One of them is religion, that ethics is fundamentally about God. And the other is something that's unfortunately popular among some university administrators, which is ethics as repair. I get evil people and I feed them Kant, and that turns them into good people. That's a misunderstanding of people and Kant. And in fact, I say, my job is not to turn Sith into Jedi. It's to give you the tools needed to reflect on something that most of you who aren't sociopaths are already committed to, which is taking other people and other creatures in the world as giving you reasons to act in certain ways, figuring out what those are. That's what we're going to do together. But at least the first week is often devoted to overcoming not a pre-college education, because in the state of Washington, at least, we don't have that in philosophy or ethics. Instead, it's unlearning what the culture tells you about ethics, which I think is a very distorted view of what it is that ethics might be.
Great. Olga, as someone that's working in curriculum as well with your with all of your work both with the UN program and then global engagement, I'm wondering if you had some reflections on this question.
Well, it's I don't make any assumptions about what my students know or where they come from. I think that's very important to kind of set the stage where what I try to do is I tell my students that it's a safe space where they can actually, if they make a statement that's not accepted, we can have a discussion about it. And it might, one person's, again, what one person may deem ethical may not be what other person deems ethical, and then we can have that conversation, right? We don't use the term ethics in my classes, but I think that's what is kind of like what is good or bad, what is moral and what is just, and I, as I said in my number 3, right? What is ethical may not be what is just. And that's what we discussed in my classes a lot. So what we consider to be, what we assume to be good, and what we assume to be is going to lead to good results may not be actually the just results for everyone. So how do we actually capture that in class? And what I have an advantage of is I have, especially in my United Nations semester class, I tend to have a very international group, right? I usually have 8 or 9 countries represented, students who are international or they're exchange students. And it becomes very interesting to see how everybody reacts to the same question very differently. And we talk about, the role of our political political structures and how they impact our views, and political cultures and how they impact our views, right? Where students come from. So those kinds of things, and I don't shy away from pointing those out in class. As long as you can create a safe space for students to feel comfortable and not put the entire country or entire culture's responsibility on them, the tendencies, and then I allow the students to react to their own culture as well, right? So it's I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I try to do in the classroom setting.
Thank you. Yuna, in our remaining moments, I'd like to bring you in here
Yeah.
for any reflections you have. Yeah, please.
Great, thank you. I also have a very international cohort normally at Oxford, so it's kind of hard to say that that's a reflection of the particular UK educational system. We barely have UK students at any given point, especially when it comes to those who choose to take the IR course. But I think, again, it's kind of similar to what Michael was saying, there's a lot of unlearning that needs to be done, particularly about implicitly held understandings of what the relationship between politics and ethics are, and not necessarily, and because they're not open, they don't know that they hold these views until they're confronted with the alternative. I find that to be kind of a really important task to do. They all kind of come with the idea that international politics operates in this kind of ethics-free or differently kind of organized sphere from our kind of everyday ethical kind of judgments about what is good and bad, or right or wrong. So kind of unpacking that often is a challenge. And I think kind of relatedly, it's not exactly about the same thing, but this is a discussion that I often have with colleagues regarding our kind of move towards decolonizing the curriculum, is that they also have a lot of implicit understandings or biases about what counts as legitimate forms of knowledge claims, legitimate forms of truth claims that can be discussed in a classroom. And so if we are to kind of provide a plural platform to think about kind of pressing ethical issues of the day, we also need to kind of take a step back and think about kind of the epistemological kind of framework that they come in with, which is not the most exciting part for the curriculum for the students themselves, but I think is one of those more important kind of stepping stones that need to be done in order for us to kind of move forward in our class discussions.
Wonderful. That's great. And that actually speaks to one of the questions that we weren't able to fully get to from Dr. J.C. DeSwan regarding biases coming into the classroom. And Dr. Hahn handled it, I think, superbly. So thanks so much. Well, I'd like to thank everyone on the panel, Dr. Michael Blake, Dr. Yuna Hahn, Dr. İlgü Özler, for their reflections, their discussions, their contributions to this topic of ethics in the classroom. I'd like to thank all of you in the audience that joined us today. I just want to remind everyone that a full recording of this event, along with eventually a transcript, will be available on the Carnegie Council website. We also want to thank the Carnegie Council for putting on not only this panel, but all of the panels and discussions that they have that we find so incredibly useful, and including the fantastic work that's published in Ethics and International Affairs. Finally, we hope that you will all join us in celebrating Global Ethics Day on October 19th this year. For more information on how to participate, you can visit globalethicsday.org. It's Global Ethics Day, that's one word, .org. So with that, I'll thank everyone and wish everyone a good fall here in the northern semester, a good spring in the southern, northern hemisphere, and a good spring in the southern hemisphere. And with that, we'll sign off. Thanks.